People believed women's place was in the home. Women cleaned, cooked, and took care of the children. It was expected that the men of the house would include the women's voice in government. Women eventually felt unheard. They followed rules that they had no say in, much like children. Women started to take action. America Pathway to the Present never clearly states the beginning of the suffrage movement, but it did state that women activists first called for voting rights at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. However, according to Doris Rutherford in her book A History of the American Suffragist Movement, the movement started in 1637 when a woman named Anne Hutchinson was convicted in Massachusetts for her religious ideas. Some people thought women's suffrage, or their right to vote, was unnecessary and that it would be a threat to the stability of American society. They were afraid that women would become too masculine, which would upset the balance of the home. Anti-suffragists believed that women wouldn't want to deal with the mess of politics. With these ideas in mind, Alice Miller, known as a woman suffrage activist and writer, wrote Why We Don't Want Men to Vote. Because man's place is in the army. Because no really manly man wants to settle any question otherwise than fighting about it. Because if men should adopt peaceable methods, women will no longer look up to them. Because men will lose their charm if they step out of their natural sphere and interest themselves in other matters than feats of arms, uniforms, and drums. Because men are too emotional to vote. Their conduct at baseball games and political conventions shows this, while their innate tendency to appeal to force renders them unfit for government. There were many suffragist groups. These groups became very active around the time of the Seneca Falls Convention. They were still active for roughly 70 years, according to America Pathway to the Present. Many known activists include Elizabeth Stanton, Susan Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, and Lucy Burns. Before Stanton was a suffragist, she was an abolitionist, so she was known for standing up for rights and questioning the government. Stanton and a friend of hers, Lucretia Mott, organized the Seneca Falls Convention to demand women's rights. Stanton was also known for her writings of the Declaration of Sentiment, her speeches, and getting her voice out there. One time she said, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman." The prejudice against color, of which we hear so much, is no stronger than against sex. It is produced by the same cause, and manifested very much in the same way. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In 1872 and 1873, Susan B. Anthony tried to vote in city elections. Both times she was denied and arrested. She campaigned for women's suffrage through National Women's Suffrage Association and National American Women's Suffrage Association. She also organized the International Council of Women and International Women's Suffrage Association. According to memory.loc.gov, Carrie Chapman Catt was the key coordinator for the suffrage movement. She started working for Susan B. Anthony in NASA in the 1890s. She succeeded Susan as the next president for NASA in 1900. In 1902, she also organized the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, then went back to NASA in 1915. In the fall of 1912, Alice Paul and her friend Lucy Burns went to NASA. They took over the Congressional Committee, which eventually became known as the Congressional Union. They were given no money, no office, no foundation, and had to build themselves up. She organized a parade to rally the women's suffrage movement on the day of President Wilson's inauguration, March 3, 1913. The parade consisted of 8,000 participants. 500,000 people were spectators. Inez Milholland led the parade as the warrior leading thousands of women on a white horse. There were a lot of anti-suffragists there, and violence broke out. 200 people were injured, but this got the women's suffrage the publicity they needed. Lucy Burns was a close companion of Alice Paul. Burns and Paul met in a London police station. Both were demonstrating suffrage ideas. She came with Alice Paul to the United States and fought beside her in all the committees and organizations. Burns was arrested 6 times, which was more than each of the other suffragists. Burns organized political campaigns for the National Woman's Party and was a powerful speaker. Doris Stevens wrote, Her talent as an orator was of the kind that makes for instant intimacy with her audience. In her book, Jailed for Freedom. Kat and her co-leader of NASA, Anna Howard Shaw, saw that they weren't getting any money back from the Congressional Union. They had disagreements with Alice Paul's unfeminist tactics. The CU eventually broke off and later became the National Woman's Party. The National Woman's Party started to picket in front of the White House in January 1917. They did this through October, dealing through beatings and harsh weather. The government didn't want the women on their doorstep, so they arrested them for the only charge they could find, obstructing traffic. In jail, they made a petition for the status of political prisoners. Under orders from W. H. Whitaker, superintendent of the Occoquan workhouse, as many as 40 guards with clubs went on a rampage, brutalizing 33 jailed suffragists. They beat Lucy Burns, chained her hands to the cell bars above her head, and left her for the night. They hurled Dora Lewis into a dark cell, smashed her head against an iron bed, and knocked her out cold. Her cellmate, Alice Kosu, who believed Mrs. Lewis to be dead, suffered a heart attack. Alice Paul soon followed her friends to jail for 7 months. She was also convicted with the same crime, obstructing traffic. During her months in jail, she and many others went on hunger strike. The government wanted to deem Paul insane so they could force-feed her. No one wanted a starving corpse on their hands. After force-feeding Paul and her friends, and after brutal beatings, the women were released from jail in November of 1917. Many people supported President Wilson because he kept them out of World War I, which began August 3, 1914. But he eventually did declare war on August 6, 1917. It was at this time Carrie Chapman Catt took the opportunity to confront him about women's right to vote. He also announced his support for women's suffrage the January after the women prisoners were released. On April 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, became law. In August of 1920, Harry Burns, historically known as an anti-suffragist, voted for women's rights, making Tennessee the 36th state to decide to ratify the 19th Amendment. 36 states was needed in order to make the 19th Amendment a law. If today you are a woman who wears pants, votes at election time, or signs contracts to rent an apartment or to get a credit card, then you are a woman who owes a debt to these women. If you take for granted that you are the guardian of your own children, you owe these women. If you assume that your paycheck will be written out to you instead of your husband, you owe these women. If you are a man who is proud to send his daughter off to college, you also owe these women. And if you would rather not take financial responsibility for your unmarried female relatives, you owe these women. Doris Rutherford in her book, A History of the American Suffragist Movement.